So I'm not going to lie or sugarcoat this, because there is never any use in lying or sugarcoating anything. Reality is bleak, and we have to face it. We live in very dark and troubled times. Now, thankfully, humanity has actually always lived in dark and troubled times, if you think about it. There's never been an age of unfettered peace and absolute prosperity. There's never been a golden age. All appearances to the contrary are simply local conditions, local in space and time. And they only appear to be in states of total prosperity because someone somewhere else is doing all the suffering. Now, I say that this fact, bleak though it is something to be thankful for because it indicates that we have not yet lost the keys to paradise. We haven't fallen from grace. We were simply never in paradise to start with. And I think that there's something liberating about that. There is this crushing desire in a lot of Western myth and media to pretend that we have somehow bungled, we've messed it all up, and we've fallen from this perfect utopia that we had. But that never existed. Okay, humanity has always been a shit show taking place on a carnival of horrors. Okay, that's history. And we can take heart knowing that we're of the same stock as the people who braved those conditions we read about today and shudder. We can live just like they lived, and some of them even thrived despite those conditions, and I think that the same is possible for us. So, okay then, fine, we live in a bleak condition, but there's more to it than that. I want to ask some questions about our condition. Okay, first I want to ask, what are the problems that we're facing which demand a solution immediately? Second, I want to ask, what does philosophy have to do with those solutions? And third, I want to ask, what does all this have to do with Kierkegaard's term, the leap of faith? Because, of course, this piece is titled, A Leap of Faith, Political Action and Philosophy. Now, as to the first question, which is, what are the problems that we face right now that demand immediate solutions? I want to avoid, as much as possible, making a list. Too often, multiplicity in regards to problems gets reduced to a mere multiplying of items on a list, and each item is then given a very brief, watered-down description. This leads to solution lists, where each problem gets an equally, correspondingly brief, watered-down answer. And the problem with these, of course, is that no problem, and thus no adequate solution, is ever going to be truly simple. The world is always more complex than you or I or anyone is going to give it credit for being. Okay, so this leads to the fact that perhaps extremely local problems on the subject's own personal level, like a door jam or a broken garbage disposal, maybe those are easily fixed, but the moment problems reach social scales, which is to say, the moment they involve human agents and politics, they become vastly more complicated. So with that in mind, I want to suggest the one foundational problem that we have to face and solve right goddamn now. And the name of that problem is instrumental reason. Now, what is instrumental reason? Well, first, let's think about what reason is. So reason is the mind's ability to formulate a way to navigate through its environment. Let's put it that way. It's the capacity to locate a way forward towards one's goals or desires in a given context. If I am thirsty, then my goal becomes get a drink. And reason is how my mind charts my course through the world to get that drink. Right now it would involve pushing my chair back, getting up and walking to the kitchen, getting a glass out of the cupboard, deciding do I want to drink coffee or water, and then getting the drink itself. Now, of course, reason as a concept is too abstract to be of any real use. One does not reason in a vacuum. It would, in fact, be impossible to do so because there'd be nothing you could reason about. Reason is always applied. It is always practical. The example I just gave of reasoning my way towards getting a drink when thirsty is, of course, an eminently practical problem-solving situation. Now, likewise, one cannot reason in general, because the totality of everything is as informative as nothing. If I were going to try to reason my way through how to resolve car trouble, say my engine won't start, well, it's useless for me to start with literally everything in the universe, or to start with a grand metaphysical question. I would be hamstrung. If my car engine isn't starting, my first question shouldn't be, what are the origins of matter? I need to instead bring my reason down to earth, apply it to the context at hand. Now, in that sense, all actual instances of reason, all moments where we are reasoning about things, are contextualized reason. There is a more or less defined aim in mind, and a more or less defined set of contexts which shape the boundary conditions for reaching that aim. That's true even in abstract human endeavors like creating art or writing a philosophy book. You still have a broad aim. And even though you might be dealing with some abstract concepts, the path by which you will attain what you want to do has some automatic boundaries. Now, in this sense, instrumental reason is not really that different from contextualized reason. However, there are some slight changes of emphasis which make instrumental reason highly problematic and prone to cause all kinds of trouble for us. You could well say that instrumental reason is what happened when contextualized reason gets hyper-contextualized. The parameters of the context and the ability of the situation to spill into other areas of life gets narrowed to the point where all considerations that are outside the aim get erased. So let's look at a silly example. Let's say I want to write a book. Obviously, if I want to write a book, I have to contextualize my reason. How do I write a book? Well, I need a subject. I need at least a rough idea of where I want to start discussing the subject and a rough idea of where I want to end discussing the subject. I need some way to encode this information, whether it's pen and paper, a typewriter, a computer with a printer attached to it, something like that. So I'm contextualizing and using reason to figure out how am I going to write this book. What's the best way? Probably to use a word processor on a computer with a printer or emailing it to a publishing company or something like that. But now let's say for a second that my reasoning gets too hyper-focused. And I start asking myself, well, if I want to write the book, first, how do I get a word on the page? Well, I can't ask that question until I figure out how to get a letter on the page. Well, I can't ask that question until I figure out what a letter is. And on and on and on. The context of my attempt to write a book gets hyper-contextualized until it shuts down. But of course, that situation, that silly scenario right there, leaves me just stuck in my room, staring at a keyboard, obsessing over how writing works. We can also think of an equally silly situation that would spill out into the environment beyond me. So let's take, for example, the eminently practical desire of eating food. Imagine that I get hungry and so I want to make a sandwich. And I think about it and I decide, well, what I'd really like is a hot ham and cheese sandwich. So I use my reason to figure out what the things are that I need to do to make a hot ham and cheese sandwich. I get out a pan, I get the butter, I get the bread, the meat, the cheese, I warm the skillet, I warm the meat, I put the cheese and the meat between the bread, I warm the bread on the skillet, boom, crusty hot ham and cheese sandwich. But now let's ramp it up and say that I become obsessed with making hot ham and cheese sandwiches. That's all I ever want to eat. But I never want to have to wait the amount of time it takes to warm the pan up. So, suddenly, I begin bending all of my capacity to reason towards the sole aim of keeping an endless supply of hot ham and cheese sandwiches at the ready for me. I buy pound upon pound of meat and cheese, loaf after loaf of bread. I keep the oven and the stove on at all times, all 4 burners constantly heating 4 separate pans. Now, of course, I'm not always hungry, but I never know when I'll be hungry, so I just keep making hot ham sandwiches all day long. And the ones that I make when I'm not hungry, I throw them away. But every 40 or 50 sandwiches, I get hungry again, and voila! Right as I get hungry, I'm finishing up maybe the 700th hot ham and cheese sandwich I've made that day. Now, of course, this scenario is patently ridiculous. But the whole reason that you can notice that this scenario is ridiculous is that you are not normally in instrumental reason mode. Usually human beings are in contextualized reason mode, and this means that you're able to expand the borders of context as the situation demands. Those borders aren't rigid and narrow, they're permeable. So you're easily able to expand that contextual border out to include the fact that while making a hot ham and cheese sandwich when hungry makes perfect sense, standing around and making hot ham and cheese sandwiches all day long to be ready for the one time you want one is a preposterous waste of time and resources. If one wants to see a serious case of instrumental reason, you don't need to look any further than the fossil fuels industry. We have a need to be able to power our machines and to do work, and in our current system we need to be able to make money while we're at it. Like it or love it or hate it, that's just how the world is right now. To that end, fossil fuel is contextually reasonable. They extract the fuel to be able to work, to produce energy and electricity, and they get money for doing so, they being the companies that extract the fuel. Well, extract and process and refine and ship, etc. However, we know that there's more to the story than just money and work. The effects cannot be hyper-localized. Fossil fuels have led to drastic increases in warming, which is hitting now critical feedback loop levels, which have hastened the impending climate catastrophe and made it unavoidable. Now, not only this, but we also know that there are other forms of fuel resource out there. Fuel resource that don't have the dirtying climatological effects of fossil fuels. Things like solar power, wind power, power using incoming and outgoing tides, hydroelectric dams, although they do have some problems of their own. But the money aspect of the equation, well, it simply isn't as profitable to produce power in that way for the power production industry. Not yet, anyway. Fossil fuels are relatively cheap to extract, and they are able to reap huge profits. So, to satisfy that hyper-contextualized, narrow aim of making more and more and more profit, they're going to limit our ability to actually expand and use better forms of power like solar, because fossil fuel in that hyper-contextualized instrumental reason mode remains the most quote-unquote reasonable thing to do, because it has the greatest economic efficiency. Now, of course, if we all decided that we were going to switch to solar or some other form of power, if we as a society turned our collective capacities of production and labor and problem solving, I'm convinced that it would be quite easy to make the switch. Human beings are very, very clever creatures, and we are quite good at things like that. But that hyper-contextualized, hyper-narrow reason demands that we stay focused on fossil fuels until the last gallon of oil gets pumped out. And of course, by then, climatologically speaking, it will likely be far, far, far too late. I don't need to say any more on this subject, though I encourage the reader to think for themselves. Think for yourself about other instances where narrow, hyper-focused aims on profit, especially on profit, has led to obviously irrational and ridiculous consequences. Wherever you find this, and you will find it plenty of times, you will find instrumental reason on display. So if we're going to tackle the irrational problems plaguing our world, we first have to tackle the flagrant abuse of reason, which is instrumental reason that leads us towards these irrational ends along such destructive paths. So then what does philosophy have to do with all that? Well, I want to say up front that philosophy is not going to be anyone's savior. The way forward does not, as I once thought, involve the establishment of a new society ruled by philosopher kings. I recognize now that this was a conceited and ridiculous belief of mine. As it turns out, people are quite able to see the ridiculous problems that instrumental reason leads to without any formal philosophical argumentation to help them along, or any philosophical training. Now, this is not a naive praise of quote-unquote common sense as a be-all, end-all solution. It's simply to state that there need be no illusion that only the wise and well-read philosopher can articulate the irrational harms and dangers of the abuse of reason. In fact, as we often see, many a philosopher becomes a pawn of whatever the power economic structure currently is, and they wind up using their reason, instrumentally, to do nothing but provide endless justifications for it. However, philosophy is not at all useless in the fight to push back against our modern tendency to overvalue instrumental reason. You see, the philosopher's task now is to wed themselves more closely than ever before to society, to philosophize along with, not in spite of, the current contemporary culture. The trick is finding areas of the culture, and these will always present themselves to the philosopher who is attentive, which are ripe for philosophical critique and analysis. A good philosopher will work to find those cultural points and to draw out their fullest implications. They will highlight the areas of tension, where cultural expectations are hypocritical and incoherent. In doing this, they will hopefully help articulate some of what common sense can point us towards. They might even highlight areas where more attention and work can be put to good use, and perhaps they can even offer up plausible suggestions for us to discuss and debate. The philosopher must take their leisure time, which is a gift that very few have, which they are fortunate enough to have, and they need to educate themselves enough to serve as a pathway, as a linkage between historical trends and facts and the current conditions of being. And from that, they have to try to put that knowledge to good use. As I see it, that is the philosopher's task now. So in short, a good service for philosophy to provide us now is to rigorously and unceasingly engage in cultural analysis and critique, to work to revive the notion of articulate cultural debate. Doing this will not magically fix society. Nothing will. We have to give up on that hope. There is no magic in the world. None of any sort. It's just us, meat and bone and blood here on the material world. But by reviving a strong tradition of intellectual and philosophical cultural analysis and debate, well, there's a good element there to add to the mix of other practical solutions and pragmatic political engagements. And this leads me to wanting to address the final question. Why is this titled A Leap of Faith? Political Action and Philosophy. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard was one of the founding personages of what would eventually morph into existentialism. I won't go into detail on his philosophy here. Suffice to say, one aspect of existence that he focused on was the relationship between his Christian faith and how he was living it out in the world. For him, one of the chief philosophical questions was something like, how does one live a true and authentic life? Now, I will admit that I think today our primary question should be similar, though I obviously do not share his religious leanings. For Kierkegaard, one had to commit to a leap of faith in the Christian sense, and marry their spiritual being as a Christian to the way they lived and acted in the world. Now, I'm an atheist, and Kierkegaard's Christianity has nothing in it for me. However, there is something to be said for the idea itself of the leap of faith. For if I'm to commit both to philosophy and to political action to help address the troubles that I discussed above, can I do so in a way that is both authentic and effective? That's a question that I and everyone must ask themselves. After all, there is no way to be sure prior to an engagement with the world, which is to say with other people, that anything productive will come from it, or that anyone will be receptive to what I have to say. People might just not give a shit about me. Maybe I get a bunch of people together and we all get the same goals and ideas and we work really hard and we completely fail. These are valid ontological possibilities. I might be shunned or teased or despised. In our current political climate, I might face the threat of violence. And all for what? There's no way of me knowing if my joining in any political struggle will be to any avail at all. Maybe climate change will truly wipe our species out in the end. So, why bother? Why give a shit? Well, I'll maybe retreat into quietism and simply watch, embittered and weakened, as the world drifts away from what I hope it to be. Now, I could do that, yes. But I choose not to. To put it bluntly, fuck that. Fuck that. To put it philosophically, I am enacting an existential choice, a moment of imposing my will to power upon myself, defining my being by shaping the way I exist in the world. To put it plainly, I am appalled at the idea of weakness and inaction, and I don't want to be the kind of person who falls into that way of being. And so, with that at my back, I choose instead to act for something rather than wallow in nothing. But isn't it still true that all this effort might be for nothing? Couldn't I get involved in politics and help campaign, or make sure to try to bus people to the polls to get more political engagement? Yes, of course I could do all of that, and it might be for nothing. We might fail. Climate change might decimate the human population. Who knows? But this would be true in literally any attempt I decide to make. Every action that I make, every step towards every aim I could ever conceivably set out for myself, I could fail. I could die of an aneurysm before I get to the kitchen to make a sandwich or get a drink of coffee. So in everything I set out to do, I am making a miniature leap of faith, in the sense that I can never know for certain if my actions will turn out to be well-founded or foolish, effective or pointless. And when it comes to politics, I just have to accept that I have limited information to act upon. I'm just never going to know all the facts. That's a fact. I will never know all the variables, nor will I ever know all the possible outcomes. However, I do know my values, and I do know at least some facts, and I do know at least some variables, and I do know at least some possible outcomes. So if I'm not going to sink into inaction and oblivion, then this limited information is just going to have to be enough. That's all we're going to get. So it's just going to have to be enough. Now, of course, I want to be humble in my actions, always open to revisiting my commitments in the face of new contexts and conditions, but still, this is the only way to soundly move forward. And so now, here I am, attempting to philosophize my way through real problems in the real world, and to act where possible and try to influence who I am able. Perhaps I will fail utterly. Perhaps not. Only time will tell, and I must accept that I may never even know.